Yeah, our next speaker is Henrik Lenzgen. He will, his work is on Cornelius Castoriadis. I'm sure that some people know him. He was involved in the 1968 movement in France very much, and he had a big discussion in Socialismus und Barbarie with Merleau-Ponty and with Sartre and others. And he's here from Frankfurt, living in Koblenz, and yeah, will speak about revolution, the reshaping of science society with Cornelius Castoriadis.
Thanks, Peter Erwin, and thanks to Inka also to give me this opportunity to present my paper here. The era of great revolutions seems to have long passed. 1776, 1789, 1848. The major societal upheavals belong to the past of European and North American history. Furthermore, the revolutions of the 20th century were unable to fulfill the promise of a better and more just society. The experiences of fascism and Stalinism, in conjunction with the rise of neoliberalism, have led to widespread belief that the grand societal leap, with its unpredictable events, injustices, and potential crimes, does more harm than good. However, revolution is not an end in itself. The societal problems that initially gave rise to revolutionary endeavors are not eradicated with the abandonment of revolution through superficial class compromise. Undoubtedly, the socio-historical situation of the global North has evolved beyond the circumstances that initially led Marx to assume that the increasing impoverishment of the working classes would culminate in a revolutionary situation. However, the promises of economic, social, and political integration made by liberal capitalism also remain unfulfilled. Instead, these established social, political, and economic systems give rise to disruptions at their peripheries and harbor profound internal contradictions. This does not signify the end of history, but rather unveils the inherently oligarchic and destructive nature of the turbo-capitalist apparatus, which can no longer maintain the appearance of control over the economy, society, and environment through expertise. It becomes increasingly apparent as a persistently hierarchical societal structure rooted in the dogma of profit maximization. This diagnosis presents us with a profound realization echoed by countless social and ecological movements of our era. The situation is undeniably besieged by crisis, yet an alternative remains elusive. The lessons learned from past endeavors of political emancipation, like the Russian Revolution, for example, caution us against placing the fate of society solely in the hands of a minority of revolutionaries who profess to possess an intimate understanding of historical trajectory. Thus, we are compelled to ask, what then is the alternative to both dictatorial upheaval and the perpetuation of the status quo? From this crossroads, a third possibility emerges in shaping a new society, a path we can embark upon together with Cornelius Castoriadis. The alternative formula of socialism or barbarism, or in its updated version, autonomy or barbarism, presents us with another choice alongside the barbaric options of capitalism and authoritarianism. The self-management of society, the realization of true democracy, and the shaping of society by the broad masses rather than solely by self-appointed political experts and societal figureheads. I will begin this overview of Castoriadis' political ideas with an introduction to his life and work, and then turn to his core political concepts. Castoriadis' eventful biography is shaped by his early politicization and unorthodox engagement with Marxism. He was born in Constantinople in 1922 and later moved to Athens, where he became involved with Trotskyism and where he studied philosophy, law, and economics. In the 1940s, he found himself trapped between the oppressive forces of Stalinism and the Gestapo, leading him to seek refuge in Paris with the aid of a scholarship. In 1948, he broke ties with Trotskyism and, together with Claude Lefort and other comrades, founded the Council Socialist Group and the eponymous journal Socialisme ou Barbarie. In his series of essays titled On the Content of Socialism, he elucidates the necessity of redefining socialism in response to the degeneration of the Russian Revolution into a rigid bureaucratic system, which represented a new form of exploitation. This redefinition entails not merely nationalization, planned economy, and the absolute power of the Socialist Party, but rather worker self-management. The analysis of the inherent contradictions of Marxism and the development of the so-called real socialism ultimately leads him to break with Marxism in the mid-1960s. Quote, "Starting from revolutionary Marxism, we have arrived at the point where we have to choose between remaining Marxists and remaining revolutionaries." End of quote. It is precisely this theoretical break that forms the starting point for his project of society. He thus no longer understands the revolution as being anticipated by theory and carried out by a revolutionary avant-garde. Rather, Castoriadis emphasizes the primacy of practice over theory. Moreover, the revolution is no longer the work of a specific social category such as the working class. For the classical Marxist understanding of revolution would merely reproduce rather than abolish the fundamental social opposition between executors and leaders. This form of social division is Castoriadis' post-Marxist take on the class antagonism between capitalists and proletarians. According to him, the division between the executors and leaders is at the same time the fundamental characteristic of the current stage of capitalism, which he calls bureaucracy. Therefore, for Castoriadis, the question of capitalism versus socialism is not primarily an economic one, but a political one, and in anticipation of the following sections, the question of autonomy. For the experience of the existing socialist systems had shown that the abolition of private ownership over the means of production had not brought about the desired abolition of the rule of the few over the many. Like Marx, for Castoriadis it is people who make history. For Castoriadis, however, the central moment of this historical movement is not determined by the development of the productive forces, but by the genuinely human ability to create new forms and ideas. For this he reserves the concept of creation. The driving moment in the history of human societies is thus the creation of imaginary meanings that manifest themselves in institutions. This creation is the work of the anonymous collective imaginary, or also the instituting imaginary. This is a power that can never be fully explicated, which mostly remains hidden in the depths of society. In contrast, explicit power in societies exists in the form of the respective social institutions. The social change that Castoriadis strives for is radical in the best sense of the word. It seizes society at its root, its institution. The defining characteristic of any society is the specific way in which it institutes itself. Thus, the respective social institution is a contingent product of human action, whose changeable character, however, usually remains hidden. For Castoriadis, it attests a state of heteronomy to the vast majority of past and existing societies. According to him, these societies are not conscious of their instituting activities. Instead, the creation of this institution is attributed to an extra-social instance, or at least to one that escapes the power and action of living human beings. Thus, heteronymous societies hide the fact of self-institution from themselves. In these societies, one encounters the institutionally anchored and secured notion of a source for the institution of society that is outside of society. The members of these societies see the origin of the law in God, in history, reason, or the ancestors. Quote, "In other words, the individuals are firmly convinced that the institution of society does not depend on them, that they cannot give themselves their law," this is precisely what autonomy means, "but that this law has already been enacted by someone else." End of quote. In the context of describing these heteronymous societies, Castoriadis uses the term closedness of meaning and institution. Institutional closeness refers to a state in which society is only understood as an instituted society, where processes of institutionalization are seen as completed and society is perceived as fully established. The instituting moment is thereby concealed and included within the instituted society. The closedness of meaning, in turn, refers to a state in which society refers to a state of society in which this closure prevails, and no question posed within this system of meaning remains unanswered. All questions that can be formulated within a society will find answers within the imaginary meanings of this society. That there can be no open or unanswered questions means that one cannot go beyond the existing instituted meanings. Quote, "In these heteronymous societies, the institution of society takes place within the closeness of meaning. All questions that can be formulated within society can find an answer in their imaginary meanings, and the questions to which there is no answer are not forbidden, but rather the members of society, due to their mental and psychological structure, are not even capable of posing them." End of quote. This observation reveals a parallel to a passage from Herbert Marcuse's book, One-Dimensional Man. There he writes that the new consciousness that forms the space for a transcending historical practice is sealed off by society. The result is a society in which people cannot imagine a qualitatively different universe of language and action. The counterpart to these heteronymous societies is based on the breaking of this closedness, which is achieved by autonomous societies. The significance of this concept lies in the rejection of closure and the establishment of a new relationship between the instituting and the instituted society on the collective level, between radical imagination and socialized individual on the level of human being, between constant reflexive thinking activity and its results and achievements at any given moment. In autonomous societies, there is an understanding that it is society itself that gives itself its laws. Quote, "Autonomy comes from autos nomos, to give oneself one's laws." End of quote. This explicit self-institution in autonomous societies includes the questioning of existing institutions and the generally accepted view of the world. Autonomy can therefore be understood as an ongoing movement of questioning existing institutions and creating new ones. As a first interim conclusion, we can therefore state that initially the task of every social movement, every political force, and every political thinker who seeks to overcome the existing social condition is to uncover the underlying meaning embodied in societal institutions. This in turn can be the starting point for finding new meanings and accordingly creating institutions that embody these meanings. Castoriadis has made an important contribution to this, so in the concluding sections of my paper I will give examples of such analysis by Castoriadis. An illustrative example of this is his analysis of the political institutions of the so-called liberal democracy, which enables him to understand this system as a liberal oligarchy. He perceives these political systems as oligarchic because a certain social class dominates society, and as liberal because the social class allows citizens a certain number of negative or defensive freedoms. In these societies, power is negated and externalized. It is declared to be something that comes from outside and threatens society. This overlooks the fact that power is actually the power of that very society. In this sense, it can be said that this freedom is largely negative. Freedom from, rather than freedom to. The freedom to govern oneself, to participate in power, rather than just being excluded from and protected by it. This difference in freedom thus marks the difference between democracy and oligarchy, according to Castoriadis. A central element of his analysis of the liberal oligarchy is his critique of the defining characteristic of contemporary democracies, which is political representation. Representation is a political imaginary that manifests itself especially in the institutions of the election and the professional politician as a representative of his electorate. Castoriadis has exposed representation as a metaphysical concept that lacks a philosophical foundation and which obscures the political disempowerment of the sovereign. Castoriadis calls the concept of political representation metaphysical, since the central idea behind it receives no philosophical clarification whatsoever. That is, the question of whether representation is possible at all. His critique thus turns against the hypostasis of representation as spectacle-like representation and proxy of the demos by professional politicians. Quote, representation means agreeing to the irrevocable transfer of power to anyone in our sole interest, and not also in the interest of the representatives, for a period of 4, 5, or 7 years, however long. But an irrevocable mandate in the sole interest of the client, even for a limited period, is absurd. End of quote. By unveiling the self-contradiction at the heart of political representation, he exposes the externalization of sovereignty disguised as transfer. What is more, by revealing the original meaning of representation, he exposes its historical contingency. The identification of representation with democracy is a phenomenon of the modern political imaginary, whereas for the longest time in political philosophy, representation was seen as an aristocratic means of keeping the broad mass of the population out of political affairs, while supporting a regime of experts and professional politicians. As Castoriadis points out, political thinkers such as Montesquieu, Rousseau, and Constant clearly saw representation as a principle, quote, alien to democracy. And even at the time of the French and American revolutions, it was widely known that representation was originally the exact opposite of democracy. These deconstructions and related exposures of the original meaning embodied in modern political imaginaries, such as political representation, then enable Castoriadis to take the second step of this autonomous movement, which is the construction of new meanings and institutions. His alternative design envisages a council democracy with recallable delegates who are to be strictly distinguished from so-called representatives. They are merely intermediaries for the constituency and can be recalled by it at any time. In this way, the council is a counterdraft to parliament. While parliament is based on the radical separation between the mass of the population, which is consulted from time to time, and its supposed representatives, who are de facto uncontrollable and irremovable, the council can enable the will of the people to express itself. To conclude, the project of a great social transformation is not one that can be led by an elite. The political will, and especially the self-activity of the masses, are not to be anticipated by theory, but are historical moments that must be channeled in the sense of emancipation, autonomy, and democracy. Social movements must succeed in mobilizing the majority of the population and activating the creative potential of this mass in order to create an autonomous society that can proclaim, "We are those whose law is to give ourselves our own laws." Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much for this inspiring talk, Cornelis Castoriadis. I think he's underestimated right now in this situation, and I think he's a good theoretic thinker for your lecture on the activists. And I'm very happy that you bring it up again. And in his big book, The Imaginary of the Society, die Imagination der Gesellschaft, was discussed here in the 80s, 85. Habermas invited him. I was working with Habermas, and he invited Cornelis Castoriadis to come here to Frankfurt, and he gave a very interesting talk. And then he disappeared. He disappeared because of the most of the, you mentioned it's the Stalinists, so the hardliner of the communist parties here in Germany, I think you see it the same way. They took over the public, and a thinker like Cornelius Castoriadis, they vanished. And I think, thank you very much for this. He uses terms like autonomy, political representative, das Imaginäre und die Institution, that is the German title of his book, that we have to create institutions and to reform institutions and not to skip them and not to criticize them as a part of this regressive system. So he's very much involved to that. Change it. Don't stop the process of making the society much more, better. And that is his intention. And when I heard your lecture, I'm sorry that I'm speaking. We're running out of time. When I heard your lecture, and I know Castoriadis very well, and your lecture again, it fits very well. And I hope that political activists have a good dialectic concept from theory and praxis. And that is, I think, a very, very big project, how to bring political activists in a theory, with a theories together, and what can theories do for political activists? Mostly separated. Oh, okay, sorry. Is there a question on it? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for your talk. I'm personally very much interested in the German November Revolution and so on, also critical theory. Now, some people say that in critical theory there's a so-called Bilderverbot. Yeah? You don't portray, so to speak, an utopia. Now, the funny thing about Marcuse is he was member of a council. Yeah? And he was disappointed. In one of his interviews he said, okay, the whole problem with the critical theory is that the November Revolution didn't work out. Okay? Now, I would ask you if you know in Castoriadis if he paid attention to that, and or did he have any direct connection with Marcuse on these kind of topics? I would be interested about that.
Well, I kind of anticipated a question like this, and I thought that would be a great topic for my PhD if I write one. Yeah, but I haven't delved into the connections between them in this regard. So,
all right. Thank you very much, Henrik. And
thanks.
I'm really excited of these two talks, and I hope you get a lot of things from this panel.